The millionaire hid cameras to protect his paralyzed daughter until he saw what the maid did. Daniel Morrow possessed the kind of success that felt almost clinical. He was the prototype of the self-made tech mogul, sharp, wealthy, and seemingly untouchable. His sprawling mansion, a fortress of glass and custom stone tucked into the most exclusive residential pocket, was supposed to be the monument to his perfect life. Sunlight didn't just filter. It streamed through those massive windows, illuminating a space that should have been filled with warmth. Yet the warmth was long gone. The shift happened on one defining, rain-swept night. A relentless downpour obscured the empty highway, and then came the terrifying sequence. The sickening hydroplane, the raw, ripping sound of the tires failing, the violent, crushing symphony of metal buckling, and the brittle sound of safety glass disintegrating. Claire, his anchor, the woman who defined his world, was gone instantly, stolen by the darkness and the speed. Daniel stood numbly on the slick asphalt, his hands shaking with a terror colder than the rain. His world reduced to a gaping, desolate void. Their daughter, little Emma, barely 1 year old, was whisked away, suspended between life and death. Emma survived the brutality of the crash, but her victory came at an excruciating price. The medical staff delivered the prognosis with the dispassionate efficiency of trained professionals. They recited the data: catastrophic spinal trauma, resulting in irreversible paraplegia, a complete severance of sensation and movement below the waist. They stated flatly that she would never walk. Daniel registered the sounds, the cold, factual weight of the words, yet they remained abstract until he lifted Emma from the hospital bed. Holding her small body, he looked down at the heartbreakingly still line of her legs, tiny and perfectly formed, yet utterly unresponsive. This was not a wound that would heal. It was the architecture of her permanent future. That was the moment he understood the true, crushing dimension of despair. The days following the funeral dissolved into an oppressive, monotonous blur. The magnificent house became a beautifully maintained mausoleum. Every object, the untouched sofa cushions, the stack of unread magazines, was a silent relic of Claire's former presence. The vibrant, casual rhythm of her life, her melodic laughter, the scent of her strong morning coffee, the sound of her voice asking trivial questions, had been systematically erased. Daniel was trapped within a suffocating quiet, each lavish room amplifying the reality that the most essential part of his life was irrevocably lost. Every night, long after the city lights dimmed, he would lie rigid, staring at the pitch-black ceiling. Occasionally, for a fleeting, cruel fraction of a second, he would forget. He'd instinctively turn toward the cool, empty space beside him, ready to whisper her name out of routine. Then the truth would slam into him. A visceral shock, heavy and cold, right in the center of his chest. Claire was no longer there, and she never would be again. Daniel would rise in the dark, moving slowly toward the crib. Emma was often already awake, her large, innocent eyes fixed upward. Her silence was unnatural and heartbreaking. She rarely cried, not because she was content, but because she seemed to have absorbed the profound lesson that tears accomplished nothing. He'd lift her, feeling the unsettling, fragile weight of her tiny body settle against him. He had once planned to teach her the balance of a bike, to chase her through manicured parks, to hold her sturdy hand crossing busy intersections. Now, those vibrant mental snapshots were nothing but ghostly projections of a life permanently denied. The weeks became a grueling test of endurance. Daniel, stretched thin between his executive responsibilities and the specialized demands of his daughter's care, finally hit his breaking point. He needed help. The revolving door of professional help began. The first candidate retreated after only 3 days, apologizing profusely but visibly shaking, admitting she lacked the expertise and the emotional fortitude for a disabled infant. The second claimed a sudden, irreversible family crisis a week later. The third simply vanished, leaving behind a terse, unsigned note on the polished kitchen counter. Each departure felt like a physical excavation of his remaining hope. He didn't condemn them. The weight of the responsibility was indeed crushing. Emma's care demanded far more than routine infant maintenance. It required surgical patience, intricate physical knowledge, and the constant, overwhelming awareness that every minor decision could dictate the quality of her future. Some mornings, Daniel stood alone in the pristine kitchen, gazing at Emma's empty high chair, his heart sinking as he faced the prospect of drafting yet another desperate job listing. Daniel developed a corrosive distrust. Every new face that crossed the threshold of his secure home triggered an automatic clenching of his jaw. Were they genuinely compassionate, or merely professional opportunists seeking a short-term paycheck? His central terror wasn't the relentless physical fatigue. It was the act of delegating Emma's safety. She was so defenseless, so heartbreakingly vulnerable. Having already lost Claire, the thought of any further loss, of the smallest injury, the slightest neglect, was an unbearable psychological burden. Driven by sheer necessity rather than belief, Daniel continued his relentless search. This desperate search, fueled by exhaustion, suspicion, and near absolute despair, eventually led to a pivot he could not have foreseen. He had no idea that posting one more listing would open an entirely new chapter in both their lives. Sophie Lauren arrived promptly on a silent weekday morning, precisely when Daniel Morrow had nearly depleted his reserves of hope for yet another interview. Daniel, weary and anticipating the usual polite failure, answered the door with his customary shield of professional reserve. Sophie looked young, perhaps barely 20. She was dressed simply in well-worn, practical jeans and a crisp light blouse, her dark hair pulled back severely at the nape of her neck. There was zero performative anxiety or rush about her. Her eyes met his calm, startlingly deep, and unwavering. "I'm here about the job," Sophie said, her voice soft but clear. "Housekeeping and childcare." Daniel invited her in and, without softening the brutal facts, laid out the full scope of the difficulty. Emma's paralysis, the constant, specialized care, the absolute necessity of relentless patience, and the need for someone who would not easily surrender. He had recited this grim monologue countless times, always watching the hope drain from the applicant's face. Sophie, however, remained perfectly still, her hands resting quietly in her lap, absorbing every painful detail as if it were personal truth. When he finished, she asked only one question, simply spoken, "May I meet her?" Surprised by her composure, Daniel led her to the nursery. Emma was awake in her crib, her wide eyes fixed on the familiar ceiling. Sophie approached with deliberate, gentle steps, lowering herself to the baby's eye level. "Hello," she murmured softly. "I'm Sophie." Then the impossible happened. Emma watched the young woman for a moment, her tiny face passive. Slowly, deliberately, her small lips curved upward. It was not a meaningless motor reflex. It was a clear, genuine, radiant smile. Daniel froze behind them, a fierce, protective ache seizing his heart. It had been weeks since his daughter had offered such an open expression to anyone but him. Sophie turned back to Daniel, her composure still unbroken. "I'll accept the position," she stated, "if you will permit me. When can I begin?" Daniel hired her instantly, fearing that even a moment's hesitation would shatter the fragile, miraculous instant. After Sophie departed, the mansion resettled into its familiar silence, but the silence felt subtly different. It was no longer pure desolation. It contained a sliver, a ghost, of potential hope. That night, Daniel found sleep impossible. He lay rigid, staring at the pitch-black ceiling, acutely aware of every ambient sound in the vast house. The sigh of the wind at the window, the steady cadence of the clock, the soft, rhythmic breathing of Emma from the crib beside him. The memory of Emma's spontaneous, joyful reaction played on an endless loop. It was a beautiful moment. *2 beautiful. And that perfection was what terrified him. He had been tricked by false hope before. He had dared to believe things would improve, only to watch the caregivers vanish and Emma retreat further into her shell of silence. He no longer possessed the emotional resilience to risk belief, especially when his daughter's vulnerability was now entrusted entirely to a stranger. Sophie's quiet confidence and her immediate, deep connection with Emma felt unsettling. felt too easy. He was a man accustomed to spotting flaws, and her lack of hesitation when hearing the diagnosis only intensified his professional suspicion. Was he missing some critical data point? Was his desperate need for relief blinding him, deceiving his judgment? Close to 3 a.m., Daniel rose abruptly. He opened his laptop in the living room's dim glow. His frantic, chaotic paranoia coalesced into a single, pragmatic decision he simultaneously hated and felt utterly compelled to execute. He sourced discreet, high-definition surveillance equipment, coin-sized lenses designed to be concealed within innocuous household objects, connecting seamlessly to his proprietary phone application. Expedited delivery, minimal installation. Just a temporary precaution, he rationalized. He was securing Emma's safety, not policing Sophie. He needed concrete certainty, just until the cold, residual fear of loss finally eased its grip. On Monday morning, Sophie arrived precisely on time, using the access code Daniel had provided. Daniel was physically seated at his office headquarters, but his focus was miles away. His primary screen, typically reserved for market analytics, now displayed the live feed from his hidden network. He had become a silent, unauthorized voyeur in his own home. Just a moment, he told himself, to confirm everything was orderly. Sophie immediately settled into a structured routine. She hung up her bag, efficiently rolled up her sleeves, and began the routine tasks. Wiping down the granite countertops, tidying the living room with the focused economy of someone who values order. Daniel watched, a flicker of professional shame stirring within him. He was spying on genuine competence. Then, a sharp cry sounded. The sound traveled clearly through the bedroom camera microphone, and Daniel instinctively cranked up the volume. Sophie dropped the dusting cloth immediately and moved with purpose toward Emma's room. There was no visible impatience, no sigh of resignation. Only a swift, reflexive response, as natural as breathing. Sophie handled Emma with a practiced tenderness, checking and changing her with efficient, gentle movements. Daniel scanned the image, searching for the telltale sign of carelessness, the flicker of frustration. He found nothing, but then the script deviated. Instead of returning Emma to the sterile safety of the crib, Sophie retrieved a colorful foam playmat, a mat Daniel had bought months ago and never once had the courage to use, and spread it across the warm hardwood of the living room floor. She then gently placed Emma on her stomach. Daniel stiffened in his office chair. No physician had ever recommended tummy time for an infant with spinal paralysis. Sophie lay down immediately, bringing her eyes level with Emma's. She didn't use exaggerated, meaningless baby talk. Her voice was calm, conversational, speaking to Emma as if the child understood every nuance. "Try reaching for the bear, Emma," she encouraged, positioning a small, brightly colored plush toy just centimeters out of reach. Emma looked at the toy, then back at Sophie, stretching her tiny arm tentatively. It didn't work. Sophie didn't pressure her. She slightly adjusted the distance, her eyes radiating quiet encouragement. Daniel understood with a sickening jolt of realization. This was not simply playtime. This was specialized, intelligent physical therapy. When Emma's endurance waned, Sophie gently began massaging the child's unresponsive legs. Slow, deliberate circular strokes, executed with innate knowledge. As she worked, she softly hummed an unknown, soothing melody. Emma didn't just smile. She let out a clear, bright, bubbling giggle, a sound Daniel hadn't heard reverberate in his home since the world fractured. Sophie continued the session using simple, everyday objects. Pot lids became distorting mirrors, followed by gentle, expressive faces. Light touches, carefully measured. Emma laughed until hiccuping, then stretched both arms towards Sophie in the universal, urgent plea of a child asking to be lifted. At his sterile mahogany desk, Daniel's pen clattered onto the polished wood. Observing this emotional current through the cold distance of a high-tech monitor, he was witnessing an anomaly he had stopped daring to believe in. This was not the dutiful performance of a hired hand. This was a human presence offering specialized knowledge, profound patience, and something exquisitely rare and heartbreakingly vital: unconditional devotion. In the days that followed, Daniel Morrow's surveillance schedule shifted drastically. He no longer checked the feeds sporadically. He watched for long, silent stretches, no longer hunting for evidence of negligence, but rather absorbing the consistent evidence of Sophie's dedicated presence. Day after day, Emma began a subtle, illogical transformation. She stopped lying in passive silence. The moment Sophie entered the room, Emma's eyes would lock onto her, tracking her movements with intense focus. She started generating small, clumsy verbal explorations, soft, urgent babbles, reaching for meaning she couldn't yet articulate. Sophie seamlessly became her interpreter. She engaged Emma in full-sentence dialogue, not as mindless baby talk, but as a gentle, continuous narration of the world around them. The angle of the afternoon light, the sound of the birds in the trees, the simple explanation that Daniel would be home late for dinner. She spoke as if Emma could perfectly comprehend, treating her as an entire person, not a fragile, damaged object of pity. Some afternoons, Emma frequently surrendered to sleep curled securely in Sophie's arms on the living room sofa. Her small head pressed into Sophie's shoulder, her breathing slow and utterly peaceful, a depth of rest Daniel had rarely seen. Watching this display of trust through the lens, Daniel felt a complex, painful tightening in his chest. Emma had never achieved this level of comfort with anyone but him. This was not merely acquaintance. This was profound, secure attachment. Then the inevitable happened. One afternoon, as Sophie repositioned Emma on the mat to tidy up the toys, the baby reached out and uttered a peculiar sound. It was guttural, indistinct, incomplete, but it was potent enough to make Daniel leap from his chair. The sound repeated, gaining a slight clarity, almost resembling a word. Sophie froze, turning to Emma, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you calling me?" she whispered, her voice fractured with emotion. Emma simply smiled and reached again. Daniel stood immobile, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He couldn't definitively name the sound, but he understood the meaning. An intrinsic, powerful bond was solidifying, forged not by time, but by consistent care and relentless love. For the first time since the accident, Daniel recognized that someone else was fully entering his daughter's painfully restricted world, not as a replacement for him or Claire, but as a steadfast, expert sentinel, giving everything without apparent motive. This newfound, fragile peace became its own source of anxiety. The fear had fundamentally shifted. He no longer worried that Sophie would fail. He was unnerved by the unsettling certainty that she knew too much, performing care with a precision and instinctive competence far exceeding that of an ordinary caregiver. Daniel didn't want to doubt her anymore, but the trauma of loss refused to allow him comfortable ignorance. Late one evening, after Emma was asleep, Daniel opened his encrypted browser and meticulously searched Sophie Lauren's full name as listed on her application. Initially, the results were unremarkable. A near-empty social media profile, devoid of the usual curated life. Then, deep within an archive, he found an abandoned academic profile. The name Sophie Lauren appeared alongside the shattering revelation. Former physical therapy student, specializing in pediatric rehabilitation. The listing included the university, enrollment dates, and references to several short research papers. The record ended abruptly in her final year. Daniel sat motionless, the cool light of the screen reflecting in his eyes. Every piece of the puzzle, the customized exercises, the specific massage techniques, the quiet confidence, slotted into place with devastating clarity. The following afternoon, Daniel returned home prematurely. Sophie was on the sofa, Emma nestled asleep in her arms, tiny fingers grasping the cloth of Sophie's shirt as if afraid of being suddenly left behind. The intimate tableau made Daniel pause, but he had to proceed. "Sophie," he said quietly, his voice neutral, "we need to talk." She looked up, and in that single glance, the composure fractured. The color evaporated from her face, her lips tightening instantly. Daniel cut to the chase, demanding to know why she had concealed her advanced studies in physical therapy. Sophie lowered her gaze, and a heavy, suffocating silence descended. Then tears ran silently. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and broken. the words clearly drawn from a deep reservoir of pain. She recounted the brutal, senseless loss of her parents in a home invasion. No warning, no chance for farewell. She had been forced to abandon her studies to survive. But the root cause of her secrecy was far deeper. Lucas, her little brother. Lucas had been born with severe motor impairments. Since childhood, Sophie had been his primary caretaker, mastering muscle manipulation, reflex stimulation, and fundamental movement guidance. He lived only 3 years. 3 years Sophie described as the most important time of her life. When he passed, Sophie whispered, gazing at the sleeping Emma, I was consumed by the thought that I failed him, that if I had been smarter, more qualified, maybe he would still be here. The room fell into a sympathetic silence. Daniel felt his own throat constricting painfully. For the first time, he saw beyond the employee. He recognized a mirror image of his own grief, the devastating, lingering conviction that one should have been able to save those they loved most. Following that raw, shared confession, the atmosphere in the Morrow home transcended its previous formality. No grand promises were exchanged, yet a quiet, profound understanding settled between them, the mutual recognition of deep, irreparable loss. Daniel's perception of Sophie shifted entirely. He began noticing the meticulous details. The extra cup of coffee silently brewed and left warming on the counter. The detailed, precise notes she kept regarding Emma's progress. The ritual question, have you eaten? A question she asked even though she knew the answer was usually no. Sophie also relaxed. Their conversations, rare at first, extended into comfortable silences during Emma's afternoon nap, often finding them seated at opposite ends of the immense sofa. Daniel found himself opening up about the early struggles of his startup, about Claire, and about the persistent, paralyzing guilt he felt whenever he entertained the thought of future happiness. Sophie never judged. She simply bore witness, never rushing to offer shallow comfort. But the most dramatic change occurred in Emma. The instant she woke, she would begin searching for Sophie. If Sophie was out of sight, Emma would produce urgent, demanding sounds, her tiny hands reaching frantically into the air. Then, one transformative afternoon, Daniel stood just outside the living room doorway and heard a sound. Still imperfect, still slurred, but utterly distinct. *Emmo. Daniel froze. Sophie, kneeling beside Emma, heard it too. Tears instantly flooded her eyes before she could stop them. She didn't correct the pronunciation or demand a repetition. She simply swept the child into her arms. Daniel turned away, a heavy, complex ache in his chest. Not jealousy, but a profound, selfless acceptance that his daughter had organically chosen this bond. That evening, as Sophie was preparing to leave, Emma cried violently, clutching Sophie's shirt with surprising strength. For the first time, Daniel intervened, the words leaving him almost involuntarily. Could you stay a little longer? Sophie nodded immediately. Sitting together under the quiet, warm glow of the living room lamp, Daniel was forced to confront an emerging truth. His feelings for Sophie were no longer mere gratitude or professional respect. They were an undeniable, quiet, and terrifying form of attraction. An emotional development that violated every boundary and timeline he had set for his widowed life. The following day, a sudden, heavy rain began to fall. Daniel felt an indefinable, restless urgency, prompting him to leave work early, as though some significant, unnameable event was about to unfold. The mansion was submerged in an unusual quiet. Emma was sleeping soundly in her room. Sophie was not in the expected places. Daniel heard a muffled, broken sound, a choked sob, coming from the hallway near the powder room. He paused before the slightly ajar bathroom door. "Sophie?" he called softly. No response. He pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted him sent a spike of pure adrenaline straight through his chest. Sophie was hunched over the marble counter, her face deathly pale, her hands visibly trembling as they clenched a small black object. A camera, one of the surveillance cameras he had meticulously installed throughout the house. Sophie stared up at him, her expression not one of surprise or even sorrow, but a chilling, controlled fury, held tightly just beneath the surface of her skin. "What did you do?" she demanded. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a scalpel. Daniel felt a burning sensation rise in his throat, a sharp sting of shame. "Sophie, let me explain." "Explain what?" She sliced in, raising the black device, the physical proof of his betrayal now resting accusingly in her hand. "Explain why you were watching me? Why you allowed me to hold your child, to care for her, to share the most painful parts of my past while you monitored me through a screen, treating me like a suspect in your own home." Daniel instinctively took a step forward, then froze. The room seemed to shrink, leaving him with nowhere to stand, nowhere to hide his failure. "I just wanted to be sure Emma was safe," he managed, his voice cracking, fracturing under the weight of his lie. "I was afraid." "Afraid of me?" Sophie let out a short, hollow sound, a laugh that was brittle and utterly shattered. "Or were you afraid that I wasn't worthy of your trust, Daniel?" Tears, hot and unstoppable, streamed down her cheeks, marking the path of her broken faith. "Do you know how much I trusted you? I truly believed, for the first time in so many years, that I had finally found a place where I could belong, a person who could actually see me and believe in me." Daniel opened his mouth, but the words he desperately needed were trapped, unformed, behind the lump in his throat. Sophie stepped past him, walking out of the narrow confines of the bathroom and into the expansive, silent living room. She looked around, and a frantic panic flashed across her face, the realization dawning that this space, which she had seen as a sanctuary, had always been a cage. One by one, her eyes discovered more tiny lenses, hidden carefully inside familiar objects, blending seamlessly with the decor, but now standing out as hideous metallic eyes. When Daniel finally returned to Emma's room, Sophie was already there. Emma had woken up from the noise, her small body shaking with frightened sobs. When she saw Sophie holding a packed duffel bag, a new kind of terror spread across the child's face. Emma reached out blindly, broken, frantic sounds tumbling from her mouth. "Ma!" Sophie collapsed to her knees, pulling Emma fiercely into her arms, tears drenching the child's soft hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered, a desperate, raw apology that covered far more than just her leaving. She stood, straightening her back, and turned to face Daniel. "Music. I love her, and I loved you too, Daniel, but I cannot stay with a man who never truly trusted me enough to see me." The door closed behind Sophie with a soft, final sigh, but to Daniel Morrow, standing frozen in the silent room, it was the deafening sound of something absolutely vital shattering into irreparable pieces. Trust, love, and the only fragile chance he had to save the small, burgeoning family that had just begun to take root in his life. The 3 days that followed Sophie's departure stretched into the longest, bleakest days of Daniel Morrow's life. Emma changed almost immediately, the light seemingly extinguished from her eyes. Her smiles vanished. She stopped interacting with her familiar toys, and the rhythmic babbling sounds she used to make were replaced by an unsettling quiet. When Daniel lifted her into his arms, Emma would writhe weakly, her eyes scanning the room constantly, searching for a presence that was agonizingly absent. At night, her crying came in hoarse, desperate, unrelenting waves, a sound of pure abandonment. The size of every time that tiny, heart-wrenching sound left her lips, Daniel felt a fresh, agonizing squeeze around his own heart. He held her. He rocked her. He walked endlessly through the house whispering hollow, empty words of comfort. But Emma didn't need him in that way. She needed Sophie. And Daniel finally understood that terrifying truth more clearly than anyone else. He tried to hire someone else, desperately seeking a replacement for the void Sophie had left. The first new caregiver lasted only a few agonizing hours. Music. Emma cried until her face was purple and she was completely exhausted, turning her small body into the wall, refusing any form of contact. The second person couldn't even manage to pick her up. Emma screamed the moment she was touched, curling inward as if trying to shield herself from an invisible threat. Daniel had no choice but to send them both away. No one could replace Sophie's particular brand of calm and love. No one. Daniel's meticulously ordered professional life began to slip through his fingers. He arrived late at his office, left early, and his mind was a frustrating blank during important meetings. Key contracts stalled, indefinitely delayed. His partners initially looked at him with grave concern, but this concern gradually curdled into deep disappointment. Daniel, however, no longer possessed the strength or the will to care. Everything outside the immediate radius of Emma's suffering became meaningless noise. At night, when Emma finally cried herself into a fitful, exhausted sleep, Daniel sat alone in the dark, silent living room. He opened his phone, his thumb hovering over the stored surveillance files. He replayed the old footage, watching ghost versions of the life he had destroyed. Sophie smiling gently at Emma. Sophie humming softly while folding laundry. Sophie waiting patiently as Emma struggled to reach for a toy. Every single frame felt like a deliberate twist of a knife in his gut. He finally realized a brutal, undeniable truth. Sophie hadn't destroyed his family. He had, with his crippling fear, with his inability to grant trust to a genuinely good person. Daniel had clung to the belief that the cameras would grant him ultimate control and security. But all they had ultimately revealed was the harsh truth he had been too afraid to face. That he couldn't protect Emma from everything, and that some things, the most beautiful, vital things, can only be held on to through simple, vulnerable trust, not through cold, clinical surveillance. In the heavy, oppressive silence of a house that had once been briefly saturated with hope, Daniel Morrow finally admitted the truth he had avoided from the start. He hadn't just lost Sophie, his daughter's competent caregiver. He had lost the woman he loved, the anchor of his life. A week after Sophie left, Daniel Morrow made the only decision that mattered, a decision he should have made much, much sooner. He took Emma to stay with his mother, the elderly woman who had quietly watched her son unravel, day by excruciating day. When she asked gently where Sophie was, Daniel didn't answer right away. He only lowered his head, shoulders slumped, like a child who knew he had committed a grave wrong. His mother didn't offer a scolding or a lecture. She simply held him for a long, quiet moment, a silent embrace that made it clear she understood everything without needing a single word of explanation. Daniel drove through a light, steady rain. The morning city outside was crowded and loud, yet inside the confines of the car, there was a dense, heavy silence. He had only one fragile lead left. Sophie's old address, the small, dingy rented room she had once mentioned fleetingly in passing. The room was empty. The landlord, a sour, middle-aged man with a cold, indifferent voice, informed Daniel that Sophie had been asked to leave because she couldn't keep up with the overdue rent. When Daniel asked desperately where she had gone, the man merely shrugged, disinterested. She said something about a shelter on the east side of the city. Daniel drove tirelessly from one place to another. 3 shelters, then 4. Music each time he was met with the same cold rejection. There's no one by that name. His heart sank a little further with every mile. Yet he didn't stop. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't running from his emotions or seeking control. He let fear, shame, and the desperate current of love guide his actions. At the 5th place, tucked into the corner of a crowded communal room, he saw her. Sophie was sitting on a hard bunk bed, visibly thinner, her face etched with profound exhaustion. In her hand, she held a small, worn photograph. Daniel recognized it instantly. Emma, the picture he had once printed and casually stuck on the refrigerator door. "Sophie," he called out, his voice rough and unused. She looked up, startled for a brief moment, but then quickly shut down, closing herself off entirely. She turned her face away as if the sight of him was an unbearable pain. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice strained. Daniel stepped closer, ignoring the curious, assessing eyes of the other occupants, and knelt directly in front of her. "Emma isn't eating," he pleaded. His gaze locked on her averted profile. "She isn't sleeping. She calls for you every single night." He swallowed hard, the admission tasting like ash. "And so do I." Sophie trembled visibly. "You didn't trust me?" she whispered. A simple statement of absolute fact. I was wrong, Daniel admitted, the raw confession causing his voice to break again. The cameras were never protection. They were just my fear, manifested in metal and plastic. But they also showed me the deepest truth, that you are the best thing that ever came into my life and my daughter's life. Sophie lowered her head, her hands tightly clenched into fists. Tears began to fall onto the backs of her hands, burning her skin. Do you know what that feels like? She asked, her voice shaking with residual hurt. To think you finally found a safe music place, only to realize you were being meticulously watched and judged? Daniel nodded slowly. I know, and I don't expect your forgiveness right away, Sophie. I just want you to know one thing. He looked up, his eyes red from lack of sleep and weeping, but steady with conviction. Emma doesn't just need you. She loves you, and I do too. Sophie drew in a sharp, ragged breath, as if the air itself was too heavy to carry. You love me? She whispered, the question hanging between them, almost afraid to believe the words. I love you, Daniel confirmed. Not because of how well you care for Emma, but because of who you are, Sophie. You walked into my life and my daughter's life with everything honest and true about you, and I destroyed that gift. Sophie looked at him then. In her eyes, Daniel saw a familiar, deep-seated fear. The profound fear of someone who had already lost everything too many times to count. I have nothing, Daniel, she stated flatly. No family, no degree, no clear future. You live in a world I have never, and will never belong to. Daniel shook his head vehemently and took her hand, his grasp firm and warm. You're wrong. Family isn't about where you come from or what you own. It's about where you are chosen to stay. And Emma has chosen you. His voice caught again. She calls for you every night, Sophie. She doesn't need a replacement. She needs you. In that moment, the last protective wall Sophie had painstakingly built around her wounded heart finally collapsed. She broke down completely, sobbing, unrestrained, unguarded. Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, trembling as if letting go would make her dissolve into thin air. I love you too, Sophie managed to choke out through her sobs. And that's exactly what scares me the most. Daniel pressed his forehead against hers, savoring the connection, then gently placed a kiss on her lips, a kiss that tasted of salt and profound relief. Sophie went home with Daniel that evening. When the door closed behind them, Emma was in her grandmother's comforting arms, her eyes swollen and red from crying, but still wide open. The moment she saw Sophie, there was a lightning-fast instant of recognition. Emma leaned forward with her entire small body, her mouth forming the familiar sound, trembling yet absolutely certain. Ma! Sophie rushed to her, pulling Emma tightly into her arms. The child sobbed into Sophie's neck, clinging to her with fierce strength, as if afraid that the slightest relaxation would cause Sophie to disappear again. Daniel stood silently behind them, his throat constricted with emotion. He knew this moment, this reunion, needed no explanation or interpretation. That night, when Emma finally fell asleep peacefully, nestled securely in Sophie's arms, Daniel walked into the storage room. He returned to the living room carrying a large cardboard box. Inside were all the cameras, every single one of them, small and cold, each representing the years of fear and the need for control that had defined his life. Daniel set the heavy box on the coffee table and turned to Sophie. I don't want to do this alone, he said softly. Sophie looked down at the silent, inanimate devices lying before them, the instruments of her betrayal. Then slowly she nodded. Daniel retrieved a hammer from his toolbox and handed it to Sophie first. She hesitated only for a heartbeat, then gripped the wooden handle firmly. The first strike rang out sharp, violent, and utterly final. Plastic shattered, metal casings bent inward. It was a decisive sound, a sound of severing ties with the past. They took turns. One camera after another was systematically destroyed. Each blow was an unspoken, binding promise. No more surveillance. No more suspicion. No more secrets. When the last camera lay in pieces, smashed beyond recognition, Daniel let out a long, shuddering breath, as though for the first time in years music, he could finally, truly inhale clean air. He turned to Sophie, his eyes wet but radiating a new, fragile light. "It's over," he music said. "From now on, there's only trust." Sophie placed her hand gently against his cheek, her warmth seeping into his skin. "And truth," she replied. In a house once haunted by the specter of fear, a new foundation was meticulously laid. One quiet evening, after Emma had fallen fast asleep, Daniel knelt before Sophie in the living room. Warm yellow lamplight illuminated the small scratches still visible on the wooden floor, marks left behind by the months of upheaval and emotional turmoil. There were no grand flowers, no prepared speeches, only one honest, simple sentence. "We're already a family, Sophie, but I want to officially choose you every single day for the rest of our lives." Sophie wept and nodded, her answer clear. They didn't have a massive, elaborate wedding, opting instead for a small, intimate ceremony where Emma, dressed in white, took a few brave steps down the flower-lined aisle entirely on her own, her small legs trembling yet proudly resolute. No one present that day, not Daniel, not his mother, and certainly not Sophie, was able to hold back their tears. Time passed smoothly. The house that had once felt so cold and monitored now overflowed constantly with warmth and boisterous laughter. Emma grew up healthy, continuing her developmental therapy, yet living the full, unburdened life of any other cherished child. Sophie realized her dream, opening a small, specialized therapy center dedicated to helping children like Emma, and like Lucas once was. Daniel consciously scaled back his professional work, choosing instead to be profoundly more present in their vibrant family life. That house, once built shakily on foundations of fear and surveillance, now stood absolutely firm upon a different, unshakable bedrock: trust, choice, and unconditional love.